From the UK to the United States, and visits from election rivals Donald Trump and Joe Biden have divided the US city of Kenosha following the police shooting of an unarmed black man. Both presidential hopefuls defied local orders to stay away amid violent protests. Wisconsin, of course, has become a 2020 swing state. Trump and Biden both desperately trying to secure voter support. Joining us now is Professor of Political Science at Cypress College in LA, Peter Mathews. Peter, good to talk to you again. How have these visits been received?
Well, there are two different kinds of leadership styles exhibited. President Trump basically went to Kenosha against the recommendation of the mayor of Kenosha. Others said, please don't come, you might create more instability. And he went there anyway, and then he refused to meet with the Jacob Blake family. He said he didn't want to meet with them because they had a lawyer, or they were anticipating having a lawyer there, but he didn't want to meet with them, and that's not a good thing because Blake needed to do that. He needed to reach out to the family to bring about healing, but he didn't. Instead, he praised the man, the 17-year-old kid who shot and killed two protesters, and that's just throwing more gasoline on the fire. To praise him and say he was acting in self-defense, the president wasn't reticent about making his point of view known about that. So that was a real problem. Biden instead met with the family. He has given them condolences, the heartfelt sympathies, the whole thing. That Biden showed a more all-encompassing, inclusive approach to bringing the country together and people together. So I think there's a different style of leadership there in each case.
What's the latest? Because last week we'd seen a little bit of evening out. Of course, Joe Biden was still ahead, but Donald Trump had come back quite a bit. Have the Kenosha protests tipped polls in favour of Joe Biden, do you think?
Actually, the numbers have been pretty stable in this last week, believe it or not. Unexpectedly, it's been pretty stable. Biden is still between 7 and 10 points ahead of President Trump in the national polls. But the swing state polls are interesting. They're much closer. He's still several points ahead in states like Wisconsin. He's closer in Pennsylvania and very close in Florida. And in Arizona, he's ahead by 7 or 8, 9 points. So it's quite remarkable that Biden and Trump's numbers have stayed pretty much the same, even with all the things going on. Most recently, though, President Trump has been called into question about his comments about military people, military soldiers who had died in war and battle, and it recalled his derogatory remarks about Senator McCain. That might have an impact on a small fraction of voters in those swing states. We have to wait and see on that.
Peter, I've asked you to take your crystal ball out several times over the past year or so and say how this is going to go. Well, it should be crystallising a little bit more. If you had to take a punt and say who will win this election in November, and don't worry, we won't hold you to it, what would you say? What's your synopsis from those watching this morning here in Australia and across New Zealand?
If the election were held today, Joe Biden would win because he is ahead in those key swing states. He's even ahead in a state like Arizona, which President Trump won by a few points last time. Biden is several points ahead in Arizona. So there is momentum that Biden has capitalized on, and he's maintained that lead. It's a small, narrow lead, though, in those swing states, but nationwide his lead is still holding between 7 and 10 points. And so if I were to call the election today, I'd say if it were held today, that Biden would win enough electoral votes to become president. But anything can happen between now and 2 months from now, as you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you remember a time in the US quite like this? I mean, there's been all sorts of upheaval through the course of time, through humanity everywhere around the world, but this seems an unprecedented time.
It is very unprecedented because it also includes this horrendous coronavirus pandemic in the world, with the U.S. being the leading country in infections and in deaths. Over 6 million people have been infected in the United States. Almost 190,000 have died. That's a huge number, and that's had a major impact on people. In fact, the one issue that's overriding everything else is the coronavirus pandemic, and most Americans give Biden better marks on that. They think that he could handle it much better. Now, if we get a vaccine, which is probably unlikely before November the 1st, if the vaccine proves to be working quite well in the testing, that could give President Trump a little bit of a boost. I don't think it's going to be ready to be used on a massive level until January, but this is unprecedented times because coronavirus, the economy is still in shambles. That's a terrible thing for a lot of people who can't pay their rent and pay their housing mortgage payments, and that's going to have an impact, and that's why Biden is ahead right now. So I would certainly say there's been no time in American history in recent decades like this.
It's also highlighting the haves and have-nots in the United States, isn't it? Because a lot of these deaths are overrepresented in black communities, in Hispanic communities, in socioeconomically challenged communities.
Absolutely correct. It is African Americans are 5 times as likely to be infected with coronavirus as white Americans. Latinx are about 3 times as likely. So the inequities between the various ethnic groups is very clear and apparent. It's also socioeconomic disparities. People with lower income have a much more difficult time surviving this. They tend to get more infected more readily because they're living in apartment buildings that are quite crowded with several family members living in close quarters. Those who own their own homes, the middle class or the upper middle class, do much better on the infection rates and even the death rates. So there is those disparities that are really important. It's highlighting it. I think Joe Biden is trying to capitalize, or at least he's trying to point these out. So these inequities can be addressed. That's a big part of the Biden-Harris campaign. And President Trump has to address that as well, because he's the one in office for 4 years, not Joe Biden.
Parts of Australia have been applauded for their contact tracing. What is contact tracing like in the US? Are you getting different states that are great at it, others that are no good? What are your thoughts there?
Australia, New Zealand, and other countries in East Asia and Europe have been remarkable in contact tracing. They made that a priority. Once they do widespread testing, these nations have gone right out to find out who it is that the infected people had been in contact with. So that's so important to spread the word to them to become more self-quarantined or quarantined. And that has been why these other countries, like Australia, have had success in fighting this resurgence that occurred in Victoria, for example. You're getting a good handle on it because how are you doing it? The United States has not been good at this much at all, unfortunately. That's been our main problem. That's why this thing spread so rapidly and quickly. And in some states, it's a little bit better, like in New York State, for example, which was horrendously hit early on. They've had the largest number of deaths, I believe, of any other state, and yet they brought it down to a 1 or 2% positivity rate, which is one of the lowest in the entire country. So it is not all evenly across the country, but in general, the U.S. has not had a comprehensive testing and contact tracing regime, which was extremely important in getting this under control. That's why it's been out of control.
What are your thoughts on the respective teams, the Trump team and the Biden team, as we move towards November? It's only 2 months away, so the whole idea of a vaccine would almost seem folly, wouldn't it, that anything was going to be used before then?
I think you're right about the vaccine. I don't think it's going to be making a big difference that quickly, because the results of it have to be seen to the voters as well. And the teams are pretty well organized right now. The Trump team is doing a lot of door-to-door campaigning and canvassing. Even with the pandemic, they've sent people out door-to-door in some of these swing states, and they've reached like 1 million voters in a 1 month period. That's a lot of voter contact, not contact tracing, but voter contact, which is very valuable in a grassroots campaign, especially in those swing states. The Biden campaign's been relying more on television ads, and he raised a huge amount of money. They raised $364 million in 1 month in August alone, and they put a whole bunch of that money into ads in the swing states to show that the country is not on the right track. People already know that, and to just highlight that and to say that Biden will do much better, and to blame Trump for what's going on. So those ads are going to be also helpful, but the Trump people are on the ground, not so much the Biden people. The debates could make a big difference too, which are coming up.
It's going to be interesting to watch that. And some of the criticism of the Democrats has been that they've been very light on policy.
That is true to some extent, and it is because there were the two wings of the party, the progressive wing led by Bernie Sanders, AOC, and the more moderate wing led by Biden, and to some extent Kamala Harris. And these two wings didn't want to have a warring faction on policy right now, but it was not good that the DNC actually did not include two of the key Sanders supporters' positions on single-payer Medicare for all health care and tuition-free college. Although Joe Biden and Kamala Harris accepted tuition-free college for those 90% below the wealthiest people. So that's kind of a compromise. But I think they didn't want to get into a lot of issues. Unfortunately, I think they should have really done that and come together with a good, positive, progressive, moderate platform combined to win this election. They need that could be their only one Achilles heel if many of the Sanders people stay home and don't vote. I think that's very important, and policy is always important in the end because people want to know what are you going to do for them in their lives, not just a feel-good type of campaign. And I think both sides will have to come up with that in the debates, especially more specific policy.
Peter, a delight as always. It's fascinating US politics. People here in this part of the world will not miss a thing on Sky News. We're going to be right across it. It's going to be an interesting couple of months. Good to talk to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Take care.
Coming up on Weekend Edition, the latest on the search for survivors